What did you learn about the hormones of love, sex, and childbirth? Do you know how you can help your hormones to flow for a gentle, pleasurable birth? Hi, I'm Debra Pascali-Bonaro, founder and director of Orgasmic Birth and host of the Orgasmic Birth podcast. Today, we're joined by a friend and colleague, Dr. Sarah Buckley. She's a trained GP family physician with qualifications in obstetrics. She's been writing and lecturing to childbirth professionals and parents since 1997 and is author of the internationally best-selling book.
Sorry, love. You've got to say GP obstetrics because I'm not an obstetrician. If you just say obstetrics, that's saying I'm an obstetrician. So that's really, sorry, you want to do that one again. Yeah, it's really important.
Yeah, I don't want to get into that trouble.
Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah.
Then I'm going to go back to this point and do it from there. So, Hi, I'm Debra Pascali-Bonaro, founder and director of Orgasmic Birth and host of the Orgasmic Birth podcast. Today, we're joined by a friend and colleague, Dr. Sarah Buckley. She's trained as a GP family physician with qualifications in GP obstetrics. She's been writing and lecturing to childbirth professionals and parents since 1997 and is the author of the internationally best-selling book, Gentle Birth, Gentle Mothering. She has a special interest in the hormones of physiological labor and birth and the impacts of interventions. In 2015, she completed an extensive report. I always say really required reading for all my doulas and parents too, on this topic called The Hormonal Physiology of Childbearing, published with Childbirth Connection in the US. She's currently a PhD candidate at the University of Queensland, researching oxytocin in labor and birth and the impacts of maternity care interventions. She's co-authored several papers on oxytocin in labor, birth, and breastfeeding. Sarah is also the mother of 4 children, all born at home and now in their teenage years and beyond. She lives on the semi-rural outskirts of Brisbane. Welcome, Sarah. It's such an honor to have you join us today.
Thank you, Debra, and beautiful to be here, and lovely to be talking to all the mamas and families and partners and all the doulas out there. Thank you for supporting families and birth.
Well, I have to say, you've given birth to 4 children at home and being a physician. So I have to ask, how did your choices for your birth impact your interest to study the hormones of childbirth?
That's a good question, Debra. So yes, I went through my family physician training and my hospital training and my obstetrics in hospital. And then I was really fortunate to support 2 friends having their babies at home. And I looked at the home birth experience and I looked at the hospital experience and I thought, oh, that home birth experience looks pretty good. And actually, it turns out that both my parents were born at home as well. So it's not so far out from my family, although my father's an obstetrician. But what actually happened, what really interested me was with my first baby, I was living in a small house in the inner city Melbourne, and my neighbour had 3 children and she lent us a bassinet, like a cradle to put the baby in, and I had the nursery set up. And then I had this beautiful and quite unexpectedly fast home birth. You can read all about it in Gentle Birth, Gentle Mothering. And once my baby was in my arms, gosh, I wouldn't have him more than an arm's length away. And I could tell that my brain had actually gone from that direction to like 180 degrees, completely in a different direction. And I could literally feel that my brain had changed in those 5 hours of labor. And I thought, whoa, what was that? Like something phenomenal had happened. And, you know, I carried that with me into my mothering, like I co-slept, like I kept my baby with me. I carried my baby around, all things that were kind of culturally out of step and certainly not how I was raised. And I went on and had the same kind of experiences with my other 3 children. And I was really curious, like what had happened to my brain? And so I started looking at the hormones of labor and birth. I was influenced by Michelle O'Donnell particularly, and then all the research now about oxytocin. And I came to understand that the hormonal processes of labor and birth are actually designed to change our brains. And it happens in other species as well, not just humans, but for women, actually, there's things that happen in our brains from those peaks of hormones. And especially, you know, well documented with the peaks of oxytocin that happen in the brain during labor and birth.
So fascinating, right? I mean, really thinking about that, you felt that so much, right? And those that are listening, I'm sure those that have given birth really felt that altered state. So you've done such extensive work around the hormones. And I know for a lot of people, they're even like, the hormones of birth, what is that? Can you give everyone a little overview? How do you explain that to someone who's just learning about this?
Well, a good perspective to take is looking at evolution, because we are mammals. We have mammary glands. We suckle our young, and we have these common ancestors through 165 million years of mammalian evolution. So the way that humans give birth is very similar to the way lots of other mammals give birth. And if you think about, what I was talking about, I mean, dogs, cats, elephants, they don't go to classes to learn how to take care of their babies, right? It has to kick in straight away after birth. So part of what I'm describing with those changes in the brain is something that happens to make sure that every mammalian mama not just gives birth successfully, but then takes care of her baby successfully, so that their offspring are, the mothers are motivated and rewarded to give that dedicated care that every mammalian newborn needs. So that's part of it, the kind of the evolution. The other part is we are placental mammals, like we suckle our young. we give birth to live, large live mammals, as opposed to marsupials over here in Australia, which is a different birth process. But through that process of giving birth to large live young, they have to come out through our uterus, through our cervix, through our vaginas, like every other mammal. So there has to be a way to make birth happen, to make it effective. And it has been effective for all of our mammalian cousins, for all of our foremothers as well. That's why we're here today. So I guess the foundation of hormonal physiology is that birth is designed to be successful. Birth has evolved to be successful. And by the way, if evolution doesn't make sense to you, you could call it God's perfect design, because whatever it is, we're perfectly designed for a successful labor and birth. And what the hormones do is enact a successful labor and birth, but not only that labor and birth is successful for mother and baby, but also, as I mentioned, that the bonding and the caretaking is successful through these changes in the brain. But the other part of it for all mammals is that lactation or breastfeeding has to be successful. So the hormones facilitate successful birth, successful bonding, and successful breastfeeding. I call it Mother Nature's superb design of making sure that all those things happen, of facilitating these processes. They also, through these peaks of labor, of oxytocin and all the hormones in labor and birth, actually feel good. So you can read that about in my Ecstatic Birth ebook. I mean, Orgasmic Birth, many women have had this experience of coming out of labor and birth and going, whoa, that was so good. Can I do it again? Or maybe not that minute, but maybe, the next day, that was phenomenal, because through these processes of labor and birth, it powerfully activates our pleasure and reward centers. So we're actually rewarded for having babies. So Mother Nature wants us to have lots of babies. So all of these optimizing of birth, optimizing of breastfeeding, optimizing of bonding is for reproductive success, but it also is designed to make birth a positive experience for mothers and for babies, actually, because they have some of the same hormonal changes through labor and birth as well. So successful birth, successful bonding, successful breastfeeding, and it feels good. What a good recipe.
A great recipe, right? So what are the hormones? Can you talk a little bit about oxytocin, right? That's our main hormone of love there. Tell us about it and how it works.
Yes, well, I've had the incredible privilege of the last 5 years working in my PhD studying oxytocin, particularly with some of the world experts in this area. So that's really what I've done the most research on recently. And it kind of encapsulates the whole thing, because oxytocin is a hormone of birth, as you may have heard of. It's our favorite birth hormone, but it's also a hormone of bonding in all mammals. If they don't have oxytocin, they don't bond with their babies. And it's also a hormone of breastfeeding. So it's a multi-purpose hormone. And you may have also heard of oxytocin outside of childbirth, because it's a feel-good hormone. There's so much research happening outside childbirth where, oxytocin makes you feel good, makes you trust people. It's been called the hormone of trust, hormone of monogamy, the moral molecule even, because it affects our interactions with each other. It's a social affiliative hormone. But in the context of labor and birth, it's actually made in the center part of our brain called the limbic system. It's made in a gland called the hypothalamus. It's stored in the pituitary gland, and then we release it into the body during labor and birth. And what happens during labor and birth is we release it in pulses from the pituitary gland. And as we release it from the pituitary gland, it travels in the bloodstream to the uterus. And when it gets to the uterus, it meets the oxytocin receptors, which I'll mention in a minute, and causes the uterus to contract more effectively. And that's actually what its name means. Oxy means fast, tocin means birth. So physically, it makes birth go faster. It's what facilitates. It doesn't actually totally cause. It's not the only cause of, but it facilitates the rhythmic contractions of labor. And if you've had a baby, you know they start small, get bigger and bigger, and in the end become virtually unstoppable. And I'll come back to that as well. But so oxytocin during labor and birth, that's in the body, but also at the same time. And this is why oxytocin can be such a feel-good hormone, because it's also released into the brain. So as it's released into the brain, it kind of filters out, it modulates. It's called a neuromodulator, lots of processes in the brain. And one of them that it powerfully affects or switches on is those reward and pleasure centers that we talked about, the dopamine centers in the brain. So basically what that does during labor and birth is it switches on the attachment systems for mothers and babies. And it means that when the mother gives birth, she has these extreme levels of oxytocin in her brain, this powerful reward and pleasure center activation, and she meets her babies for the first time. We're talking all mammals here, right? She meets her babies for the first time, and so her babies become intrinsically a source of reward and pleasure for her. And that's ecstatic birth, that's orgasmic birth. That's why it can feel so good from this release inside the brain. Now, going back to what happens in the body, so it travels to the uterus, and what it finds is the oxytocin receptors. So every hormone has its own receptor. Some actually have several receptors. Some receptors act on several hormones, but oxytocin and its receptor actually kind of monogamous. There's one receptor, one hormone. And the way I look at it, it's like a key and a lock. So the key is oxytocin. The lock is the oxytocin receptor. And when oxytocin finds the lock, the receptors on the outside of the uterine muscle cells, it binds to them. And it basically like turning a key into a lock. It sends a chemical message into the cell saying contract. And just as oxytocin levels go up as labor progresses, they actually are 3 to 4 times higher at the end of labor than the beginning of labor, the number of oxytocin receptors actually goes up in the lead up to labor. So that at that onset of labor, the mother's optimally ready for an effective labor and birth by having lots of oxytocin receptors in her uterus, which means that her uterus is going to be very sensitive to oxytocin. And what we found in our research was that the levels of oxytocin at the start, the spontaneous, we say physiological onset of labor, are really quite modest. They're not very high because there's this incredible increase in the number of receptors. It goes from about 1.8 density to about 3,500 density. So that's how sensitive the mother's uterus is. Wow. And it really peaks at that onset of labor. And I'll just share an anecdote about that, because I actually breastfed through my second pregnancy, my toddler, and every morning she'd come in for a little suckle. That was fine. But the day I went into labor, she came in and had a suckle, and I had to literally throw her off because I got such a massive contraction. And that was really interesting. The day before, no effect. The day I went into labor, a massive effect because of that increased sensitivity that I had to that hormone. So we have that receptor sensitivity amongst a whole lot of other pre-labor preparations. Read chapter 2 of my hormonal physiology report. It's not just the receptors, it's prostaglandins, it's inflammation. A whole lot of things happen in the lead up to labor to make the mother at that peak of readiness. And by the way, the baby's also at the peak of readiness, but that's another whole story. So that's the peak of readiness. And then the oxytocin comes in and other hormonal changes. And we start to get the buildup of labor. So the way that I describe labor, as I say, it's like a snowball. It starts small, becomes bigger and bigger. In the end, becomes virtually unstoppable. And the reason it becomes virtually unstoppable is because of positive feedback. And I'll describe what I mean by that. But particularly, there's a lot of positive feedback cycles, but one that's very well known is an oxytocin positive feedback cycle. And if you want to see the visual of it, go to my website, look at my blogs, look at my epidural blog. There's a picture of it. So what happens is that we're releasing oxytocin from the brain down to the uterus, and it causes the uterus to contract. And that causes sensations. You might have noticed this. So the sensations, especially the baby pushing down, are fed back to the brain by a specific sensory nerve pathway. The sensory nerves is what tells the brain what's going on in the body, right? This is a specific sensory nerve pathway. And during labor and birth, that information by that sensory nerve pathway about the sensations in the uterus fed back to the brain tells the brain to produce more oxytocin. So it's not producing less, it's not a negative feedback to keep things the same, it's a positive feedback. So it tells the brain to release more oxytocin. We get more oxytocin released into the bloodstream, to the uterus, stronger contractions, more sensations, as you notice, more oxytocin release. So it's a positive feedback loop. And this is one of the processes that fuels that snowball of labor. And labor becomes bigger and bigger, and in the end becomes virtually unstoppable. You may have noticed that you can't stop it even if you want to at the end of labor. And then at that moment of birth, we have this intense sensations, more feedback, more oxytocin, all designed to have a quick and efficient pushing stage. And then we know, as I said, at that peak, at that pushing stage, oxytocin levels are 3 to 4 times higher than what they were at the start of labor. And then also we have at the hour after birth, even higher levels as the baby comes onto the mother's body, the baby's instinctive behaviors. The baby will find the breast, will massage the breast with its hands, will eventually suckle. And all of those things stimulate oxytocin release for the mother. So even from those high levels at birth, she can have levels up to 10 times higher in the hour after birth, which is kind of what makes it this magical hour. You know, you may have heard that, the magical hour after birth. We call it an early sensitive period, because what's happening at that time is different to what happens at other times. You know, the mother's body is maximally sensitive to oxytocin in her uterus, probably in her brain as well, maybe even in her breasts. There's a whole lot of preparations. The baby's also actually has peak oxytocin levels, which I'll talk about in a minute. So they come together, and that release of oxytocin that the mother has in response to her baby's behaviors actually saves her life by making sure her uterus contracts up nicely. It also has another effect you may have heard of. It actually causes a vasodilation, an opening up of the blood vessels on the mother's chest wall. She can get a flush, and that vasodilation literally pulses heat to her baby. And that's why, again, you may have heard of this, why skin to skin is such an effective way of keeping babies warm, because the mother literally pulses heat to her baby. And if the baby's a bit cool, the mother's body pulses more heat. If the baby's a bit warmer, the mother's body pulses less heat. There's this interaction we call mutual regulation. So the whole process of oxytocin from the beginning of labor, through the onset of labor and birth, through the peaks of labor and birth, and then the time after birth, this magical hour after birth, is designed to optimize the effectiveness, the safety of labor and birth for mothers and babies. It's designed to optimize bonding through these peaks of oxytocin in the brain, which not only switch on her pleasure and reward centers, but in women, it actually changes personality through these peaks of oxytocin. And then the breastfeeding, because those high peaks of oxytocin in the hour after birth make sure that mother and baby are in this perfect, we say, calm and connection state. That's one of the effects of oxytocin. It makes us relaxed to begin breastfeeding. And of course, it's a hormone of breastfeeding as well. It's a hormone that's released when the baby suckles. So mothers has even more oxytocin, not just in that first hour after birth, but through her whole breastfeeding career. She has these intermittent increases in oxytocin, which have some of those same effects of bonding, of relaxing, of calming, a whole lot of other ways that oxytocin facilitates and optimizes the mother's body for breastfeeding as well.
It's so fascinating, right? Like, as you talk, and I've heard you say this, many times before, but I'm still in awe of how the body works and how the body grows these additional receptors, right? And that positive feedback loop. But I also am aware as a doula that sometimes situations make it a little bit more challenging for people to release their own oxytocin. So for those that are listening that are pregnant or partners saying, well, how can I help? How can we ensure a good oxytocin flow? What are some of your suggestions?
Well, just to start with the basics again, if we go back to evolution and we look at our mammalian cousins, how did they give birth to ensure their oxytocin is flowing? Because these things are even more critical in the wild, right? Our birth has evolved in the context of the wild, so birth has to be efficient. It can't linger on for a long time, right? So what other animals do is they make sure they're in the safest place possible. And in fact, oxytocin can't be released if we don't feel safe. Yeah, so that's critical, right? So make sure you're in the safest place possible. Our mammalian cousins also are surround themselves, or most of them are social birthers. You know, they surround themselves with a circle of elephant helpers or a dolphin midwife, another female who attends it. Mice have another experienced female who helps. Some animals are more solitary birthers. Cats tend to give birth by themselves. You may have noticed this if you have a cat. You kind of wake up the next morning and there's the mama cat licking her babies in the cupboard. But what the animals do is make sure they're in the safest place possible. And from the perspective of our brain, safe means familiar. Yeah, if we're in an unfamiliar place, we don't know if we're safe or not. So making your circumstances as familiar as possible. Obviously home, you know, hormones tend to flow better, like, you know, fewer interventions needed at home. And you may also have this experience of laboring at home and then you move to hospital and everything slows down or stops because you've gone to an unfamiliar place. Your limbic system is going, oh, I don't know if this is safe, you know, the primitive part of your brain. So how can you make that transition and that hospital space as safe as possible? And some of it comes down to your senses, because, you know, the senses tell us what's familiar and what's safe. So taking familiar smells, you know, burying your head in your own pillow, taking your partner's t-shirt, you know, essential oils, whatever smells are familiar to you. You know, familiar sound, like some women wear noise cancelling headphones or play music that they're familiar with, so they're not hearing that bustle of the hospital and the beeping of the machines. That's really important. You know, low lights, because generally, day living species tend to give birth at night, and we give birth under low light conditions generally. Melatonin levels are higher, and our adrenaline, our daylight alertness hormones are lower. So, you know, dim light, if you can dim the lights, that will help the oxytocin release. And also, you know, if you can be with familiar people. So really that's the number one. How can you have familiar people around you? And, you know, there's a lot of research showing that having your own midwife, one-on-one continuity of midwifery care has so many benefits to the outcomes of labor and birth. And having your own doula has so many benefits to the outcome of labor and birth, because you're with someone who's familiar to you. You've known them before. And this is how we've birthed across generations. You know, we've always had someone familiar with us. My great-grandmother was a granny midwife in a local community. You know, you had someone from your community that came and helped you at the birth, and you didn't have strangers there. So how can we minimize the impact of strangers? Because that's always going to impact our limbic system, our primitive brain to some extent. So, you know, particularly staying at home as long as possible, because the other thing is these positive feedback loops. There is a point in labor and birth, like the snowball, where it becomes unstoppable. So again, having a doula with you at home who can help you to know when it's time to go to hospital, when labor has become so big and so unstoppable that transition to hospital isn't going to derail the progress of your labor. So those are some ideas, I'm sure, as doulas and as mamas as well. You've got some ideas for how you can help yourself to feel safe. And I know we're going to go on and talk about this, Debra, but you know, the hormones of labor and birth, the processes, the flow of having a baby is almost identical to the processes and flow of making a baby. So if you're thinking about what's the best place to have a baby, you know, you could think, is this a situation where I could make a baby? And that is the ideal situation. And if it's not, how can you make it as intimate, as quiet, as dark, as safe as possible, would be my number one take home message.
And I appreciate that you brought us there too, because you know I was going there. So what other ways? Because, you know, would you say that birth is a part of a person's intimate and sexual life?
Well, I think what's extraordinary is that we even have to ask the question, to be honest, Debra, because it happens in the sexual parts of our bodies, right? It happens in our vaginas and our vulvas, you know, like they're sexual parts of our body. Our breasts are sexual parts of our body. So, you know, I think in modern birth, in order to kind of have strangers in there and have it happen in another context, we've had to kind of convince the population that birth is not part of our sexuality, but it is. Of course it is, you know, and some of the noises that women make in birth, you know, can sound like making a baby, right? And it's the same flow of hormones. It's oxytocin. We release huge amounts of oxytocin at orgasm. We release huge amounts of oxytocin when we push our babies out, right? So oxytocin is a hormone of sexual activity. It's a hormone of orgasm. You know, it's a hormone of breastfeeding. So, you know, it really emphasizes a continuity really of our sexual cycle. You know, we go from menstruation to conception to pregnancy to birth to breastfeeding and back to menstruation, and it's all part of our sexuality. So definitely. And also, you know, that actually peak of oxytocin at that moment of pushing, some women can experience that as a literal orgasm, you know, the baby coming down, the oxytocin peaks. I mean, it's the same process as having an orgasm during sexual activity. So orgasmic birth is not just a fancy idea, it's a physiological reality.
Thank you. My heart sings on that too. And what about other ways? Because I have a lot of people talk to me about masturbation or doing things in labor that would increase their oxytocin with pleasure. What do you feel about that?
Look, I'm excited to see some research in this area. And I know that there is some studies being done. And, you know, it's a kind of old midwives trick, you could say, like Anna Mae Gaskin, the mother of midwifery in America. She said the energy that gets the baby in can help get the baby out. And I know that you have your own orgasmic tricks as well in labor, because, you know, like when labor slows down or stops, which it often does when we're not feeling private and safe, what do? We've created what I call a hormonal gap. Yeah, the individual isn't feeling safe, and it's not just a woman. Like if we have an animal in a zoo, you know, that doesn't have their circle of elephant helpers, that's the same situation, and birth gets very distorted. The processes of labor are difficult in those circumstances. So, you know, that's kind of what we've created. And it's no surprise really that labor often slows down or stops when women go to hospital, right? And then what happens, we've created a hormonal gap where oxytocin isn't being released. So we give a synthetic oxytocin to bridge that hormonal gap. And I know we're going to talk about this in another podcast, but, you know, why not release your own oxytocin rather than get an artificial kind that doesn't work as well as your own? So, you know, hugging, anything that makes you feel safe and private, going into a small room. Often women will instinctively choose the smallest room they can to give birth, the toilet, the shower, you know, in a hospital, they'll give birth under the shower, you know, so that privacy and safety. And, you know, oxytocin is the cuddle hormone, you know, cuddling with our partner, with someone we love. For some women, touch, you know, it's very individual. Some women like animals, some women are like cats, we're solitary birthers. Some women are like elephants, they want the whole circle of elephant helpers around them. But whatever it is that makes you feel safe. But certainly hugs, touches, releases oxytocin, and sexual activity, as you say. I mean, what more pleasurable way to make labor happen than to stimulate yourself sexually or have a partner do it? You know, like there are studies showing nipple stimulation can help to get labor started or going, you know, in some circumstances if the woman's at an adequate state of readiness. You know, so any of those sexual activities can promote the release of our own oxytocin. And the other great thing is, if you do this, you have to make yourself private. You have to shut the door and put a sign on the door, and nobody's going to come in. So you've actually, you know, done yourself a benefit in lots of ways. And of course, if you're not in a hospital, if you're before transfer, or, you know, if you're having a baby at home, all of these things are available to you. And I know that you've recommended that your clients take a vibrator to hospital. Tell us about that one, Debra.
Yes, definitely. I've really found that that's been helpful, and in two different ways. I always have to smile, because if they just take it out and hold it, everybody leaves the room. So I call it the privacy tool, because no one wants to stay to see if you're really going to use it or not. So I've had clients that didn't really use it on their clitoris, but just had it there to say, we need some privacy. But I've had other people that have felt that it has been amazing, really took them from pain to pleasure. And they really felt the difference, that when they were doing stimulation, all they felt was pleasure. And when they weren't, they really felt more of the challenge. What do you think about that, that difference?
I think whatever gets you through, really. I mean, there's lots of different tools that women use. I mean, classically, we use breath, sound, and movement. I mean, that's brilliant, because, you know, it's, you could say, it takes your mind off the pain, and also it can convert pain to pleasure. I mean, that's what it's about, really. You know, and the release of oxytocin actually has natural pain relieving effects. So that makes total sense. I mean, I was thinking about my last baby I had at home here, and the way that I dealt with the pain was, every time I got a contraction, I had to have my husband right there in front of me, and I looked him in the eye and I said, I love you, I love you, I love you, I love you, I love you. And that released oxytocin as well, right? And it took me into this altered state. And if he wasn't there to receive that, it was painful. So yeah, there's lots of ways to create oxytocin, but sexual activity creates even more oxytocin in the brain, and that's going to, you know, stimulate the reward and pleasure centers. It's going to have these analgesic properties. It's going to put us into the calm and connection, and it's also going to release oxytocin to the uterus and help to to facilitate the contractions of labor as well. But I also want to add something I didn't say previously, which is that as a neuromodulator, that one of the ways that oxytocin works in the brain is it shifts the balance in the autonomic nervous system. And I'll explain what I mean by that. So the autonomic nervous system is kind of like the automatic nervous system. It's the part that is continually adjusting our blood pressure, our heart rate, our skin temperature, our digestion, a whole lot of things we don't have to think about, right? It's all happening automatically. And it's generally balanced between what we call the sympathetic, which is the fight or flight, or even the alertness center. Yeah, if there was a loud noise in the room, you get a rush of adrenaline, you'd be very alert. But even in the daytime, when you're up and alert, you have higher levels of adrenaline, your sympathetic is a bit switched on. And then the other part of it is the parasympathetic, which is the rest and digest, relaxation and growth system. So that's the part that we're in when we're eating, when we're kind of lying down and relaxing after eating, also when we're suckling, when we're sleeping. All of those things are parasympathetic. And what oxytocin actually does, and this is part of its feel-good effect, is it shifts us from the sympathetic to the parasympathetic. So parasympathetic goes up, we feel more relaxed, we feel more calm, we often want to lie down, and our sympathetic goes down, our fight or flight hormones go down. So sexual activity as well, and releasing oxytocin is also going to help with that calm and connection effect. And it's a really valuable effect in labor because it is an intense experience. I mean, there's only one way out for our babies until the last 800 years, with cesareans, there's only one way out, and that's through these powerful contractions of labor. So Mother Nature provides this help for all mammalian mothers so that it's not an excruciating experience. So there is pleasure with it, and that is oxytocin release in the brain, the calm and connection, the pain relieving, and the reward and pleasure center activation right through labor, and that's the great thing about our positive feedback loop. As the sensations get more intense, we get more oxytocin release in the brain, so we get more pain relief, more calm and connection. So, and as labor progresses, there's more in the brain. So all of those things happen. So, if you're using sexual activity in labor, you're kind of taking a bit of a shortcut and getting yourself to higher oxytocin levels as well, and increasing the pain relieving, the calming and connection as you described.
Yeah. And doing it with love, right? I love even how you just said, I love you. And that's bringing that oxytocin up. Well, Sarah, you've given us so much to think about. I'm sure all the listeners are like, wow, right? And I know that you'll come back and we'll talk more too, that when there are challenges in birth, how are there some hormonal gaps and how can we work to fill them? But I know people today are going to say, how can I get in touch with you? Where can people find you?
So my website is sarahbuckley.com. I've got links to my hormonal physiology report. And if you go to the All the Science and More tab, you'll also find links to all the papers that we've published so far on oxytocin. So we've done research on oxytocin levels in physiological labor and birth, oxytocin levels in breastfeeding. And now we're doing research on oxytocin levels in birth with interventions. It's called systematic reviews, where we pull all the research that's been done. So we're about to submit the next paper. So watch the space, and we'll have lots to talk about next time. As you say, hormonal gaps. We talked about a hormonal gap of not feeling safe and how we can fill that. So we'll talk about hormonal gaps with synthetic oxytocin, with epidurals, and with cesareans and induction.
Well, thank you so much. And to all our listeners, we'll have all Sarah's information in the show notes. So if you look just below this, you can click on her links. And thank you so much for all the research that you're doing, for all that you're continuing to learn and share with us on the importance of the hormonal physiology of birth and sex.
Thanks, Debra. And thanks everyone for listening. May all your hormones flow.
Thank you. Bye.